July 16, 1945. A heavy cruiser, USS Indianapolis, departed San Francisco Bay on the most secret mission of World War II. In her hold, components for a little boy, the atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima. Captain Charles McVeigh III commanded 900 sailors who had no idea what cargo they carried. The mission was so classified that even McVeigh knew only that the crates in his hold were vital to ending the war. Indianapolis made the fastest crossing to Tinian Island in history, 10 days at flank speed. On July 26th, she delivered her secret cargo. The atomic bomb components were unloaded. Indianapolis's mission was complete, but the ship's crew had no idea they were about to face something worse than any battle. A maritime disaster that would become the Navy's worst loss at sea, and a survival ordeal that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. This is the story of USS Indianapolis, the ship that delivered the weapon that ended World War II, then disappeared into the Pacific with 900 men aboard. How a Japanese submarine sank her in 12 minutes. How 900 sailors ended up in shark-infested waters. How the Navy didn't know they were missing for 5 days. And how only 316 men survived the sharks, the sun, the thirst, and the madness. It begins with 2 torpedoes in the midnight darkness. July 29, 1945. Midnight. USS Indianapolis sailed from Guam to Leyte in the Philippines. The war was nearly over. Japan was collapsing. Surrender seemed weeks away. Captain McVeigh had requested a destroyer escort, but none were available. The cruiser sailed alone through submarine-infested waters. At 12:05 a.m. July 30th, Japanese submarine I-58, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Makitsura Hashimoto, spotted Indianapolis silhouetted against the moonlight. Hashimoto fired 6 torpedoes. 2 struck Indianapolis on the starboard side. The first torpedo destroyed the forward section, killing hundreds instantly. The second hit the fuel tanks, creating a massive explosion. The ship lost all power immediately. No electricity, no radio, no way to send a distress signal. Indianapolis began sinking bow first, rapidly. Captain McVeigh gave the order to abandon ship, but the PA system was dead. The order spread by word of mouth in the darkness. Men scrambled to reach the deck as the ship tilted forward at an impossible angle. 12 minutes after the torpedoes hit, USS Indianapolis rolled over and sank, her propellers still spinning as she went down. 300 men went down with the ship, trapped below decks or pulled under by the suction. 900 men were now floating in the Pacific Ocean in the middle of the night, many wounded, some burned from the explosions, all wearing life jackets. They had no lifeboats. There hadn't been time to launch them. They had no food, no water, no shelter from the sun. And the sharks were coming. Dawn, July 30th. The survivors took stock of their situation. About 900 men floated in groups scattered across miles of ocean. Some clung to debris. A few had found life rafts, but not nearly enough. The men were in relatively good spirits that first day. The Navy would realize Indianapolis hadn't arrived at Leyte. Search planes would be sent. Rescue was probably hours away, a day at most. They just had to survive until then. They didn't know the Navy wasn't looking for them. A series of catastrophic failures meant Indianapolis's sinking went unnoticed. The ship hadn't sent a distress signal. Power was lost too quickly. The Navy command at Leyte didn't report Indianapolis overdue. Ships often arrived late, and with the war ending, tracking was lax. A Navy radio operator had intercepted a Japanese submarine's report of sinking an American ship, but dismissed it as propaganda. Nobody was looking for 900 men dying in the Pacific. The first day, injuries from the sinking took victims. Men with severe burns died. The wounded succumbed to blood loss. Bodies floated away from the groups. And the sharks arrived. Oceanic white-tip sharks, attracted by blood in the water, began circling. The first attacks came on the first day. A Mun would scream, thrash, and disappear beneath the surface. His companions could do nothing but watch in horror. By the end of day 1, hope remained. By day 2, it would begin to fade. Day 2, July 31st. The sun beat down mercilessly. Men wore kapok life jackets that provided buoyancy but no protection from the sun. Skin blistered. Lips cracked. The worst enemy became thirst. Surrounded by water but unable to drink it, some men gave in to temptation and drank seawater. It was a death sentence. Salt water accelerates dehydration and causes hallucinations. Men who drank seawater went mad within hours. The hallucinations were horrific. Men saw islands just over the horizon and swam toward them, removing their life jackets, drowning in pursuit of mirages. Some saw Indianapolis floating nearby, intact, and swam down to go back to the ship, drowning 50 feet below. Others saw Japanese soldiers and fought invisible enemies, exhausting themselves and slipping beneath the waves. The sharks attacked constantly. Hundreds of oceanic whitetips circled the groups. They'd bump a mun first, testing. Then they'd strike, pulling victims under. The sharks preferred attacking lone swimmers who drifted from groups, but they also attacked men in the main groups. Survivor Lowell Dean Cox later testified, "The worst part was the screaming. You'd hear a mun scream, and you knew a shark had him. Then the water would turn red, and he'd be gone. Sometimes they'd pull him in halfway down, and he'd be screaming for you to help him, and there was nothing you could do." By day 3, August 1st, hope was dying. Men were dying every hour from injuries, dehydration, sharks, exhaustion, or giving up. The groups of survivors were shrinking, and still, nobody was looking for them. Day 4, August 2nd, exposure, dehydration, and exhaustion took terrible tolls. Many survivors were delirious, hallucinating continuously. Some became violent, attacking fellow survivors they believed were Japanese. Others simply gave up, removing their life jackets and sinking peacefully. The groups of survivors fragmented. Men drifted apart. Some groups maintained discipline. Officers kept men together, led prayers, and enforced rules like no drinking seawater. Other groups dissolved into chaos. Giles McCoy, a Marine private, later described the horror. "Men were dying all around us. We'd wake up in the morning, if you could call it that, because we never really slept, and find men dead in their life jackets, still floating upright. We'd pull their jackets off for men whose jackets were failing and let the bodies drift away." The shark attacks intensified. The sharks had learned the humans were easy prey. They attacked during the day, at night, constantly. Survivors estimated hundreds of shark attacks over the 5 days, though exact numbers are impossible to know. Dr. Lewis Haynes, the ship's chief medical officer, one of the few officers to survive, did what he could for the wounded and dying with no supplies, no equipment, just his hands and voice. He amputated gangrenous limbs with nothing but a knife. He held dying men and gave them final comfort. He kept as many men alive as possible through sheer will. By day 4, of the 900 who'd entered the water, fewer than 400 remained alive, and still, the Navy didn't know they were missing. August 2nd, 11 a.m., Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn piloted a PV-1 Ventura bomber on routine anti-submarine patrol. He wasn't looking for survivors. He was checking navigation equipment. While adjusting his antenna, Gwynn spotted an oil slick. Following it, he saw something impossible. Men in the water. Dozens of them. He couldn't believe it. What were men doing in the middle of the ocean? Gwynn radioed, "Many men in the water." He began circling, dropping life rafts and survival supplies. His report reached Navy Command, causing immediate confusion. What men? What shit? Nobody realized it was Indianapolis until Lieutenant Commander Robert Adrian Marks, piloting a PBY Catalina seaplane, arrived on scene. Marks was supposed to circle and wait for surface ships. Instead, he violated orders and landed in 12-foot swells, an incredibly dangerous maneuver that could have destroyed his aircraft. Marks and his crew pulled men from the water. The PBY could hold 15 people maximum. Marks pulled 56 men onto the plane and lashed more to the wings. The plane couldn't take off again. It was too heavy, but Marks didn't care. He was saving lives. At 6:45 p.m., destroyer escort USS Cecil J. Doyle arrived, guided by Marks's position. Commander Graham Claytor ordered searchlights turned on, breaking blackout protocol and risking Japanese submarines, because saving survivors mattered more than regulations. Through the night, ships arrived and pulled men from the water. The rescue continued into August 3rd. Of the 900 who entered the water, only 316 survived. The rescued survivors were in horrific condition. Severe dehydration, extreme sunburn, saltwater ulcers covering their bodies, shark bites, and psychological trauma. Many were delirious, some catatonic. Hospital ships treated the survivors. Doctors couldn't believe anyone had survived 5 days in those conditions. The combination of sun exposure, dehydration, exhaustion, and constant shark attacks should have killed everyone. But the survivors' ordeal wasn't over. The Navy immediately classified the disaster as secret. Survivors were ordered not to discuss what happened. Families of the dead were told their loved ones died in action with no details. Why the secrecy? The atomic bomb. Indianapolis had delivered atomic bomb components. The Navy didn't want the mission compromised or the disaster blamed on the atomic program. Survivors were sent home with orders to remain silent. Most obeyed for decades. The trauma was so severe that many couldn't talk about it anyway. Nightmares of sharks, thirst, and drowning men haunted them for life. Edgar Harrell, a Marine who survived, later wrote, "I still dream about it. I'm back in the water, and the sharks are coming, and I know I'm going to die. Then I wake up and remember I survived. But the men who didn't survive, they're still there in my dreams." The survivors carried guilt for decades. Survivors' guilt, wondering why they lived when their friends died. Many struggled with alcohol, depression, and PTSD before that term even existed. And the worst was yet to come. The Navy would court-martial Captain McVeigh and blame him for the disaster. December 1945. Captain Charles McVeigh was court-martialed by the U.S. Navy for hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag and failing to order abandoned ship in a timely manner. The charges were absurd. McVeigh had been following standard procedure. Zigzagging wasn't required unless specifically ordered, and visibility was good. The abandoned ship order was given immediately, but power loss prevented it from being heard shipwide. The Navy needed a scapegoat. 580 sailors had died on McVeigh's watch, and someone had to be held accountable. Never mind that the Navy had failed to notice Indianapolis was missing for 5 days. Never mind that the Navy had sent Indianapolis through submarine waters without escort. Never mind that the Navy radio operator who intercepted the Japanese submarine report had dismissed it. Captain McVeigh was a convenient target. In an unprecedented move, the Navy called the Japanese submarine commander, Makitsura Hashimoto, to testify. Hashimoto stated that zigzagging would not have prevented the sinking. He would have hit Indianapolis regardless. Despite Hashimoto's testimony, McVeigh was convicted of hazarding his ship. The sentence was lenient, a letter of reprimand, but the conviction destroyed him. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz set aside the conviction, acknowledging it was unjust, but the damage was done. McVeigh's career was over. His reputation was ruined. Survivors defended McVeigh fiercely. They knew he'd done everything possible. They knew the Navy was scapegoating him to avoid accepting institutional responsibility. But McVeigh couldn't escape the guilt. 580 men had died under his command, and the Navy had officially blamed him. For years, Captain McVeigh received hate mail from families of the dead, blaming him for their sons' deaths. The Navy's court-martial had given them a target for their grief and anger. McVeigh tried to move on. He remarried, tried to build a new life, but the guilt and shame never left him. On November 6, 1968, at age 70, Charles McVeigh took his service revolver, went outside his home, and shot himself. He was found holding a toy sailor in his hand. His suicide note was never made public, but friends said he'd never recover from the court-martial and the hate mail. He died believing he was responsible for his men's deaths, but the survivors never gave up trying to clear his name. For decades, they lobbied Congress and the Navy to exonerate McVeigh. They testified that he'd been scapegoated. They presented evidence of the Navy's failures, the lack of escort, the failure to notice Indianapolis was missing, the dismissed submarine report. In 1996, 12-year-old Hunter Scott, a student doing a National History Day project, began researching Indianapolis. He interviewed survivors, reviewed documents, and concluded McVeigh had been wronged. His project became a campaign. Scott testified before Congress. Survivors testified. The evidence was overwhelming. On October 30th, 2000, 55 years after the disaster, 32 years after McVeigh's suicide, Congress passed a resolution exonerating Captain McVeigh. The Navy officially cleared his record in 2001. McVeigh's name was finally cleared, but he never knew it. He died believing he was guilty of killing his men. The USS Indianapolis disaster remains the worst loss at sea in U.S. Navy history. 580 men died in the sinking or the 5 days that followed. The survivors, 316 men, lived with trauma that never fully healed. The nightmares, the guilt, the memories of sharks and dying friends haunted them for life, but they also formed an unbreakable bond. The USS Indianapolis Survivors Organization met annually for decades, keeping the memory of their lost shipmates alive. They fought for Captain McVeigh's exoneration. They told their stories so the world would never forget. In 2017, 72 years after the sinking, a civilian research team led by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen discovered Indianapolis's wreckage 18,000 feet below the surface. The ship rests in the Philippine Sea, a war grave where 300 sailors still remain. The discovery brought closure to many survivors and families. The ship had been found. The dead could finally rest. The last survivor, Harold Bray, died in 2022 at age 103. With his death, the last living connection to that terrible night ended. But the story survives. The USS Indianapolis disaster teaches lessons about institutional failure, scapegoating, and the price of war. It's a story of survival against impossible odds, of men who endured hell and lived to tell about it. Remember Indianapolis. Remember the 900 men who entered the water. Remember the 316 who survived. Remember Captain McVeigh, who was wrongly blamed and died before vindication came. And remember that sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought with enemies, but with the ocean, the sun, the sharks, and the human capacity to endure the unendurable.